Some mornings in Africa feel different, almost heavier with meaning. Imagine this: as the sun rises over Ouagadougou, women from 60 different African nations walk slowly into a wide, echoing hall. Many of them have traveled all night. Some are community leaders, some are mothers who left their farms for a few days. Others are entrepreneurs carrying notebooks full of ideas they've waited years to share. Their clothes are colorful, their steps tired, but their eyes full of hope shine brighter than the morning light that filters through the windows. There were no trumpets, no grand announcements, yet everyone in that room felt it. Something important was about to happen. They had come for more than a forum. They came because across the continent women are rising, not quietly, not slowly, but with the steady force of a generation that has carried families, communities, and entire nations on their backs for decades. And on this morning they gathered to hear a message from the leader of a country that has become a symbol of courage and change, Burkina Faso. But beneath the applause, a deeper question hung in the air. Could these women, through entrepreneurship, industry, and unity, be the force that finally pushes Africa toward true independence and self-sufficiency? Could they succeed where governments and institutions have struggled for generations? And here is the question for you. Watching at home, especially those who have lived long enough to see the world change again and again, is this finally the moment when Africa steps forward, not as a continent asking for help, but as a continent choosing its own destiny through the leadership of its women? If this message speaks to you, stay with us. And please, before we continue, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this broadcast. Every gesture helps amplify these voices across the global African community. Because what you're about to hear is more than a speech. It is a turning point. The hall in Ouagadougou settled into a deep, almost sacred quiet as the last groups of women took their seats. You could feel the room breathing, hundreds of lives, hundreds of stories, all converging in a single moment. What struck many observers that morning was not the size of the crowd, but the mix within it. Women from massive cities like Nairobi and Johannesburg sitting beside women from the deserts of Niger, the forests of Congo, and the fishing villages of Sierra Leone. Their accents, clothing, and traditions were different, yet they shared the same determination. This was not a political rally. This was not an international summit dominated by diplomats. This was Africa's women gathered to speak about building their continent with their own hands. When the president of Burkina Faso finally entered the room, rose not out of ceremony but out of sincerity. This was a leader many of them had watched from afar, a man known not for polished speeches, but for direct words and unfiltered truth. As he approached the podium, he didn't begin with policy or grand ambitions. Instead, he addressed them with the simplest, most intimate greeting: "Good morning, dear and beloved mothers. Good morning, dear and respected sisters." Those words changed the atmosphere instantly. In a continent where women often carry the greatest burdens without recognition, hearing a head of state speak to them not as voters or workers, but as family struck a deep chord. He began by acknowledging their sacrifices, something many of them had never heard from any official. He spoke of the pain of pregnancy, the struggle of childbirth, and the heartbreak of watching children grow up without opportunities. In that moment, he wasn't a president standing above the people. He was a son speaking to the women who had shaped him. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was warm, grateful, human. Then he shifted the room's attention to a truth many prefer not to face: the tragedy of Africa's youth dying in the sea while trying to reach Europe. He described the images he had seen: lifeless bodies washed ashore, dreams swallowed by the water, because those young people could not find dignity or survival in their own motherland. The room grew still again. Some wiped their eyes. Others stared at the floor. These were not statistics to them. They were neighbors, cousins, sons, daughters. The president's voice didn't rise in anger. Instead, it carried something heavier: responsibility. "We do not want to see that anymore," he said. "We believe Africa can provide for its own children." From there, he drew a clear line between Africa's suffering and its path forward: women. Not as victims, not as supporters, but as the leading force of economic and industrial transformation. He spoke plainly, almost bluntly, about his belief that women are more disciplined with finances, more committed to long-term goals, and more capable of turning small ideas into lasting institutions. He pointed to industries that desperately needed women: agriculture, food, processing, textiles, small-scale factories, local manufacturing. These sectors, he explained, were not merely economic opportunities. They were the foundation of Africa's independence. There are many jobs, he said, that only women can do because they are patient. What he proposed was nothing short of revolutionary, creating nationwide programs for women in rural areas, bringing water systems closer to farms, opening spaces for production, and giving women the tools and financing to process Africa's own resources instead of exporting them raw. His message was not, "We will help you." It was, "We will build this together because we cannot succeed without you." And then came an unexpected invitation. Burkina Faso is open. Come build your businesses here. We will support you. Many women nodded. Some whispered to each other. A few began writing notes. It was the first time some of them had ever heard a leader tell them directly that they were needed not as symbols, but as partners in the reconstruction of a continent. By the end of this first part of his message, one thing was unmistakable. This was not a speech about women. It was a speech about Africa's future and the women who would carry it. As the president continued, the atmosphere in the hall shifted in a way that could almost be felt on the skin. The women weren't merely listening anymore. They were leaning forward, hands clasped, brows furrowed, hearts open. The first half of his message honored their sacrifices. But now the tone deepened. He was preparing to enter the most painful part of Africa's story and the moment that would become the emotional peak of the entire gathering. He spoke of the children of Africa not as a political subject, but as a mother would gently, sorrowfully, yet with an ache that carried generations of loss. He described young people, barely men, barely women, leaving home because they believed the world across the sea offered a life their continent could not. He spoke slowly, allowing each word to land. It pains every woman to see the children they brought into this world, unable to survive in their own land. Then came the moment that stilled the entire hall. He described the bodies washing up on Mediterranean shores, silent, nameless, carried by waves that did not know the dreams they once held. Many had heard stories. Some had lost relatives. A few had lived through attempts to leave themselves. But hearing it acknowledged by a head of state in such a raw and unfiltered way made the pain feel shared. Women covered their faces. Some reached for the hands of the strangers beside them. A few shook their heads trying to hold back tears. This was the emotional high point, a collective exhale of grief, shame, and yearning. But he didn't leave them in sorrow. He lifted his voice not in shouting but in a steady conviction. We want to change that. We do not want to see that anymore. The room erupted, not with applause yet, but with a murmur that rolled through the crowd like a wave agreement, anger, hope, all tangled together. Even the translators paused for a heartbeat before continuing. Then he moved to the political high point, the moment that transformed grief into unity. He reminded them that Africa's greatest obstacles were not only colonial interference or foreign pressure, but Africa itself, its divisions, its internal rivalries, its inability at times to speak with one voice. It was a rare thing to hear a president say openly, "Among us Africans, we do not love one another. We must transcend this." It was bold. It was risky. And that is why it cut through the room like lightning. For a moment, the hall fell into a heavy silence. Then came applause, not loud and chaotic, but long, deep, and full of recognition. These women knew the truth of his words. They had seen neighbors feud, ethnic groups distrust each other, and nations compete instead of collaborate. And that was when he revealed what he believed could heal the continent. Women. Not armies, not politicians, not foreign partners. Women. When women speak, he said, we listen. It pierces us. It can make us change our decisions from one moment to the next. The reaction was immediate. For the first time, the applause became thunderous. Women rose to their feet. Some laughed through tears. Others placed hands over their hearts. The hall transformed from an audience into a community bound by shared purpose. In a room filled with leaders, entrepreneurs, farmers, teachers, activists, he wasn't speaking to their titles. He was speaking to their power. When he declared that women could be the force to end conflicts across Africa, many gasped softly. For women from war-torn regions, Sudan, Congo, Somalia, Cameroon, this wasn't theory. It was life. And hearing a president say that their voices could stop violence wasn't merely inspiring, it was validating. The final surge of emotion came when he pointed to the future. Through you, we can unite Africa. These weren't just words, they were a responsibility, a calling, a challenge placed gently but firmly in the hands of women who had already carried so much. By the time he closed this section of his speech, the mood in the hall had transformed. The sorrow was still there, but woven through it was something stronger, a sense of personal duty, of continental sisterhood, of rising hope. The high point was not just his words, it was the realization among the women present that he truly meant them. As the echoes of applause faded, the president's message naturally turned toward the deeper implications of everything he had just said. And this is where the women in the hall truly understood that his speech was not ceremonial. It was a blueprint, one with real consequences for daily life, community stability, national reform, and the political direction of an entire continent. The first and most immediate consequence he pointed to was the transformation of family life, the smallest but most powerful unit of society. In many African homes, women are the anchors managing food, education, health, and emotional strength. When a mother gains economic stability, the change radiates outward. Children eat regularly, they stay in school. They stop dreaming of dangerous journeys across the sea and instead see a future in their own land. A woman who can process goods, run a small enterprise, or lead a cooperative can feed not only her own family, but dozens of others. For many in the audience, these were not theoretical ideas. They were the realities they lived every day. From families, he moved to local communities, explaining that the empowerment of women creates new centers of productivity. Small agro-processing hubs, community markets, women-run workshops, and cooperative-owned mills that keep wealth circulating locally. When women have access to financing, water systems, and basic infrastructure, entire districts experience revival. Rural areas that were once dependent on imports suddenly become supply points for nearby towns. The president emphasized that this local prosperity is the first step towards something larger: national stability. Because when women take leadership roles in production and entrepreneurship, unemployment shrinks, food shortages diminish, and frustrations that often lead to social unrest begin to fade. Communities that once depended heavily on humanitarian aid start standing on their own feet. This shift, subtle at first, creates a long-term reduction in the kinds of tensions that can flare into protests, insurgencies, or cycles of violence. And that leads directly into the political impact of everything he proposed. A country where women generate income, create jobs, and steward community resources is a country with a more stable political climate. Women, he said, do not easily fall for political manipulation. They tend to be pragmatic, consensus-seeking, and peace-oriented. Their growing participation in local economies eventually pushes them into leadership roles in town councils, provincial committees, and even national assemblies. In other words, empowering women economically reshapes the entire political environment. The president did not shy away from acknowledging Africa's internal problems: division, mistrust, fragmentation. But he insisted that women have the power to mend fractured communities, to mediate among conflicting groups, and to soften hardened political positions. In regions such as the Sahel, where conflicts have persisted for years, the involvement of women is often the difference between stalemate and breakthrough. He spoke of wars and disputes, not as abstract crises, but as human wounds that women uniquely know how to treat. Women can help soothe hearts, he said. Women can help a great deal in the conflicts that plague Africa. The room understood. Women from Congo, Sudan, Mali, Ethiopia regions touched by conflict reacted visibly. They nodded slowly, some clutching notebooks, others whispering to neighbors. They knew he was right. Politically, the president's vision implies something groundbreaking: a shift from top-down leadership to community-rooted leadership. A model where development is not imposed by distant ministries or foreign partners, but grown organically through local women who understand the needs of their people. And that is why the stakes are so high. If women rise, the entire political landscape of Africa changes, with more accountability, more unity, and a stronger push for genuine independence. If they do not, the old cycle's dependency, instability, division continue. By the end of this section, the women in the hall understood the weight of what he was asking. This was not a request for support. It was an invitation to reshape the destiny of nations. For many viewers in the United States, especially those above 60 who have lived through dramatic chapters of American and global history, the president's message echoes something familiar. It recalls a time when the world was rebuilding after World War II, when women stepped into factories, shipyards, engineering rooms, and farms to hold society together. America remembers the era of Rosie the Riveter, when women didn't just support the economy, they saved it. So when African leaders now speak of women as the backbone of a rising industrial continent, the connection is clear. It resonates with Americans who watched their own mothers and grandmothers build the foundation of post-war prosperity. The president's call for African women to lead industrial transformation does not sound revolutionary to an American elder, it sounds logical, even overdue. But from a broader American perspective, there is more at stake. The United States has long viewed Africa through the lens of aid, security, assistance, or geopolitical competition. Rarely has it framed Africa as a center of emerging industrial power. Yet that is exactly what is happening. Across policy circles in Washington, analysts are beginning to acknowledge that Africa, young, resource-rich, and increasingly self-aware, is moving toward a model of development that prioritizes independence over external dependency. And this shift is forcing the world to rethink its assumptions. To older Americans who lived through the Cold War, it may feel familiar, nations declaring their intention to chart their own path, resisting pressure from world powers, and asserting cultural and economic sovereignty. But what makes the African moment distinct is the central role of women, a demographic often overlooked in global development narratives. In Europe, the reaction is mixed. Some governments quietly support Africa's push for self-reliance, recognizing that stability on the continent reduces migration pressure. Others view the rhetoric of independence with concern, worried about losing influence in regions they once dominated. International institutions that have shaped Africa's economic structure for decades, IMF, World Bank, EU, are watching carefully as countries like Burkina Faso shift toward internal production and reduced reliance on imports. From the Middle East and Asia, the response is more pragmatic. Gulf nations see opportunity in partnering with African women-led cooperatives for agricultural supply chains. China recognizes that community-level empowerment could create new markets for local manufacturing. India sees echoes of its own post-colonial struggle for economic identity. But the most significant global question is this: what happens when Africa, the world's youngest continent, puts its economic future in the hands of women? From an American senior's viewpoint, someone who has witnessed the civil rights movement, women's liberation, and economic shifts over decades, this moment feels historic. They may see in Africa what they once saw at home, ordinary people demanding dignity through work, empowerment, and ownership. And then there is Burkina Faso itself. Under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, the country is not merely calling for change, it is becoming a symbol within global Africa news outlets, a symbol of a continent asking to be respected on its own terms, a symbol of a people choosing to build instead of flee, a symbol of a future where Africa's most overlooked population, women, reshape the political and economic balance of the continent. To the world, this movement is a quiet revolution. To Americans over 60, it may feel like déjà vu. As the gathering in Ouagadougou drew to a close, something lingered in the air, something that did not fade when the president left the stage or when the applause quieted. It was the sense that a page had turned quietly but unmistakably in the story of Africa. The women who walked into that hall were not the same women who walked out. They carried with them a renewed certainty that their voices, their labor, and their unity could shape the destiny of a continent once fractured by history but never defeated by it. Yet inspiration alone is not enough. And this is where the president's message carried a gentle but urgent warning. If Africa does not unite, if its women are not empowered, then the tragedies that haunt the continent will continue. Children will still risk their lives at sea. Communities will remain vulnerable to conflict. Nations will fall back into economic dependence. The same painful cycle will repeat itself year after year, generation after generation. He reminded them indirectly but unmistakably that history does not reward hesitation. It rewards those who act. The responsibility he placed on women was immense, but not impossible. Women have always been the quiet force behind Africa's survival. Now he asked them to be the visible force behind its renewal, to build businesses, to process raw materials, to strengthen families, to resolve conflicts, to unite nations where politics alone has failed. For viewers around the world, especially in the United States, this moment is a reminder of something deeply human. The world changes when ordinary people decide they have carried enough, sacrificed enough, waited long enough. Many watching today lived through eras when their own country was reshaped by the courage of women, by grassroots movements, by those who refused to be silent. That same spirit is rising in Africa now. And it is rising with purpose, because in today's Africa news, from village cooperatives in Ghana to new factories in Mali, from rural gardens in Tanzania to technology hubs in Burkina Faso, the story is the same: women stepping forward, refusing to be left behind, refusing to let their children inherit a future shaped by fear or dependency. And under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, the momentum is becoming impossible to ignore. But the question remains, and it is a question only you, the viewer, can answer. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's reforms are truly enough to transform Africa's future, or will the continent need even bolder leadership to secure real independence? Can Africa trust its new generation of leaders? Or should someone else rise to succeed them? Your voice matters, especially now. If you feel you are witnessing history taking shape, please share this video so others can understand the magnitude of what's unfolding, and subscribe if you believe that real truth, should be heard more loudly than the headlines. Africa is rising, women are rising, and the world is watching.